Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to Robert Sports. I'm your host, Robert. All right, as we count down to the Daytona 500, we are at 84 days until the Great American Race. We're doing the countdown video, and we're also doing either a champion profile and or a topic. Today's topic will be NASCAR Cup Series by the decade, the 1960s. One thing that'll stand out about the 60s was we'll never have that many races in a decade again. 60s was when we were doing 50, 60 races a year for the Cup Series, racing on dirt, half mile, quarter mile, everything. Daytona, Talladega, the whole 9 yards. Talladega was built 2.66 mile, bigger than Daytona. Some of the drivers that came to prominence in the 60s are all-time legends: Richard Petty, David Pearson, Ned Jarrett, Junior Johnson. These are the kind of the winningest drivers of the decade, and we had the Wendell Scotts of the world, who was there, did get a win, who pioneer in the sport. So we're gonna run down a bunch of the stats from the 60s. Number one, we had 522 races, so that's 52 races a year average in the 60s. Now we race 36. We had 728 different drivers start a NASCAR Cup Series race in the 60s. 55 different winners. We had 44 drivers start at least 100 races or more. 28 drivers start 150 races or more. 15 drivers were in 200 or more races, and then 6 drivers started 300 or more. On the win side, we had 16 drivers with 10 plus wins, 8 drivers with 20, 4 drivers with 30, 2 drivers with 50, and 1 driver had 101 wins in the 1960s. The first race of the decade technically was November 8th, 1959 at Southern States Fairgrounds. Jack Smith was the winner. The last race of the decade was December 7th, 1969 at College Station, Texas. Bobby Isaac. Which kind of ironic is when Bobby Isaac won the championship for 1970, he won the last race of the 60s. So Richard Petty, 449 starts in that decade. Wendell Scott, 408. Neil Castles, 335. David Pearson, 332. Ned Jarrett, 325. Buck Baker, 302. G.C. Spencer, 298. And Elmo Langley, 283. If we look back at the 50s, Buck Baker made 310 starts in the 50s. So he was on that list and on this list for both decades. Not too many drivers will be on both decade lists like that. Now, the most starts without a victory: Neil Castles, 335, G.C. Spencer, 298, Roy Tyner, 237, Curtis Kreider, 228, Henley Gray, 205, John Spears, 196, James Hilton, 183, and Earl Brooks, 172. The most wins for the decade: Richard Petty, 101, David Pearson, 57, Ned Jarrett, 48, Junior Johnson, 34, Fred Lorenzen, 26, Joe Weatherly, 24, Bobby Isaac, 21, and Rex White, 21. Now, as we know, Junior Johnson, he was on the 50s and on the 60s most wins list as well. Now, one thing that the 60s did bring us in NASCAR, it brought us multiple time champions in the decade as well. Let me pull that up here. Oops. So 1960, so when the decade started, Rex White won the title. We had Ned Jarrett. He was a 2-time champion during the decade. David Pearson was a 3-time champion. Richard Petty was a 2-time champion. Joe Weatherly was a 2-time champion. The best winning percentage of the decade: Richard Petty, the king, 22.49% of the time. He had 101 wins and 449 starts. Fred Lorenzen, 21.31%, 26 wins and 122 starts. David Pearson, 17.717% winning percentage, 57 wins and 332 starts. Now, one thing about David Pearson, he was always a part-time driver. Now, there was 3 years where he ran the vast majority of the races, his 3 championships. But if you think about it, if he would have been in more races that year, so say he raced the same amount of races as the King did, he would have had 77 wins. Can you imagine? That's another 20 wins if he would have raced in more races. We may not have a 200 win Richard Petty. We could have a 201 win David Pearson if he would have raced in more races, because he won so many races, but he only raced part time a lot. Junior Johnson, 16.75 winning percentage, 34 wins and 203 starts. Joe Weatherly, 24 wins and 159 starts, 15.09%. Ned Jarrett, gentleman Ned Jarrett, 325 starts, 48 wins, 14.77%. Dick Hutcherson, 14 wins, 103 starts, 13.5%. Rex White, 21 wins, 155 starts, 13.55%. Average finish for the decade of the 60s. We had a Petty leading Richard at 8.01 in 449 starts. Remember back to the 50s, Lee Petty led the 50s with a 7.45. Rex White, 8.36. Ned Jarrett, 8.40. Joe Weatherly, 8.58. Dick Hutcherson, 8.6. David Pearson, the Silver Fox, 9.03. James Hilton, 9.42. And Jim Pasquale, 11.1 average finish. So the 60s brought us so many races. If you look back, we had 40, 46, 52, 53, 61 in 1964. And that's the year Richard Petty won 27 races. And he won 10 straight. 54, 40, 42, 51, so many races. 1972 is when that all changed. When Winston got involved, we cut 50s to 40s down to 31 races. And that is what we consider the modern era. But in the 1960s, the cars had changed, the drivers changed, but one thing that stayed the same was the competition. We had so many races, so many different winners. We had the cream of the crop. You had the Richard Petty and Penner Enterprises. You had David Pearson. He drove for Homo Moody a lot. He drove for the Wood Brothers. You had Ned Jarrett. Junior Johnson became a car owner in the late 60s, which stepped away from driving. So that is NASCAR by the decade, the 1960s. As we get into the 1970s, you'll see how the sport has changed when Winston came in, and how different teams, change the sport, and fewer races, and get into the 80s, you get the different drivers as well. So stay tuned to Robert Sports Show for that. Also check out the Day 84, Car 84 preview, 84 days until the 2022 Daytona 500. As always, thanks for watching Robert Sports Show, and don't just have a great day, have a spiffy day. Robert Sports Show, your YouTube leader in sports channel content.